Hey, Kitty. How are you?
Good evening.
Oh, good evening. Good to see you.
I am well.
Yay!
Bread today.
That's huge.
It makes mushroom shaped.
That's amazing. How did you make it go that shape?
Oh man, I put too much. I made too much dough.
Yeah,
Yeah. How are
very
you?
impressive. Good, thanks. Yeah, all good. Just started watching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Oh
About,
really? I haven't
about,
seen that yet.
oh, okay. I'm about half an hour in. It's going well so far. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So is that like sourdough or proper bread, or what is it?
I use fast action yeast, so
Ah.
I need to give in my sourdough credentials because they're not applicable anymore, obviously.
If you don't make it in 2 weeks, that's it. You're out.
Yeah,
You're out of
actually,
sourdough club.
yeah, I actually did. I had my sourdough starter for so long.
Yeah.
Then eventually hit a bit of a low point in lockdown and kind of forgot to feed it for a couple of weeks, and then it needed to get chucked out.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Hey, Katie. Hey, Nick.
Hey, Katie. Hey, Nick.
Kitty's just showing us her mushroom. Sorry, they have mushroom creations made out of bread.
Made a mushroom out of bread?
Yeah, it's very impressive. Yeah.
It got very enthusiastically. It rose very enthusiastically from the tin, so all of the slices are like mushroom shaped. Just
Super
a second,
impressive.
I'm going to check on the dog.
Oh, you got a dog as well. Hey. How are you, Katie? It sounds like you're typing away at something.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just
It's okay.
doing the Secret Santa. Would you like to help?
Ah.
It
When you say help,
1 and 22.
saying random numbers, I can think of random numbers.
Between 1 and 22.
Yeah, okay. 7. How fast do you want them?
Slowly, because I need to check if they've already been allocated.
Okay.
Yep, 7.
26.
That's not between 1 and 22.
Oh, 22. Okay, all right. 17.
Mm-hmm.
3.
Not 3.
5. It feels like I'm playing number wang. If you
That's fine. Yep.
Michelin Web. 12.
That's number wang.
Mm-hmm.
2.
Nope.
Oh. 18.
Mm-hmm.
14.
Nope.
21.
Yep.
19.
Nope.
I've lost track.
That's okay. Are you bored now?
I was thinking I could do this in Excel or in SQL for you and just send you the result. But then Nick could probably do the same.
Well, there's only 22 numbers, so it's not actually that time consuming to do it randomly.
Yeah, I suppose.
No, it's of diminishing returns because the more numbers you do, the more you've got to remember what you've done before, which is quite a tough mental challenge.
No, I'm not asking to remember what he's done before because I'm checking.
Yeah, but that's the bit that takes the time.
How are you, Nick?
All right. I didn't sleep very well last night, so
No.
Sort of crashed. Pretty tired.
Oh dear. Did you wake up kind of midnight, or did you just not be able to get to sleep?
No, I got to sleep, no problem. But I woke up at 5 and then just never fell back asleep.
Oh, that's evil. Hey, Frankie.
Hi, sweetie. How y'all doing?
Good. We're thinking of random numbers for Katie,
You
And
can
we're
stop
all
now.
and we're being impressed by Kitty's mushroom that was bread, but it's now a mushroom again. And I've lost track of what it is. It's bread that looks like a mushroom, not mushroom that's bread. That's too confusing.
What? What?
Get Kitty to show you the mushroom.
Show somebody who's showing me a mushroom.
Get Kitty to show you their mushroom.
Kitty, show me your mushroom.
Very personal request.
It's not.
It's not a sex thing, I promise.
Oh well, I don't know. I'm not bothered then. May
It's
I?
just a loaf of bread that looks like a mushroom when you slice it.
I love that. Can I see it?
I
Can
mean,
I
if
see it?
you want.
Yes, I do want. I heavily want. I'm very into bread. Oh, what's going on there? Oh. Ah! Oh, that probably does look like a mushroom. You could slice it into huge slices and like fry it and pretend that you were a tiny borrower person and you were eating slices of mushroom.
You could make a grilled cheese sandwich with mushrooms on your mushroom bread. I don't even like mushrooms, and I feel like that sounds tasty.
Plus one for that. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. How are you all today?
I drank too much tea, and I'm worried that I'm going to really need to pee towards a dramatic point in this.
Oh no!
Well, you can go now if you want.
What
Just
if
have.
you? What if
Have you tried? Have you tried your best?
I have, but I drank a lot of tea just like about half an hour ago.
Do you have like? What were you going to say? Em?
Just turn off your camera and take the story to the bathroom. Just do it.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Smart, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or do you have like a kind of wide mouth bottle that you could have by you, just
And a
in
funnel.
Well, that makes way more sense. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need like a Sunny D bottle or something.
Yeah. Don't move the camera. Just go for the bottle.
I have an ex who used to swear by Lucozade bottles as the ideal receptacle for peeing in. So there you go.
You think why?
I'll order some Lucozade.
It was like the kind of the aperture on a Lucozade bottle is kind of wider than like on a Coke bottle or something, and I think it like fit the sort of relevant equipment fairly nicely and snugly, so it like went in fine, but there was also no kind of like rattling around or like danger of kind of spillage through, it wasn't like peeing in a bowl. This is recording, isn't it?
It is.
This is definitely recording.
You do have the power visiting, but it is still interesting to hear that, like, the thought that goes into this stuff is someone who doesn't have a penis.
Yeah,
fuck it.
yeah,
I
that's
mean,
true. This is something I've never thought about.
No,
Nobody wants a rattly pee.
no.
I've never tried peeing in a Lucozade bottle, but I might have to for science.
After investing in a shiwi?
After investing in a shiwi, exactly.
Definitely.
The list of activities we're going to do is just growing. And we'll meet up.
We're gonna be so
This is a
talented.
group activity now.
We have a really well-organized camping trip.
We'll set the
Everyone's
Guinness
got
World Record
problems.
of the most consecutive. No.
Oh, cheesy, crazy. Well, okay. Well, moving swiftly on from that topic. Let's see. Hey, everybody. Hey, Tom. Hey, Pina. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Pina.
We've got Gordon. We've got Jen. Yay! Hi, Asher. Duncan, Kim. How are you feeling, Kim? Are you getting better, sweetie?
Not yet.
Well, that's no good.
My fox is taking shape, so it's fine, right? Like, look at that.
Oh, it's amazing.
Oh,
So if it goes to the middle day, you're going to do something right.
that's adorable. Will you post a picture on Storytime when it's done?
I can do that.
Does your fox have a name?
No, you can name it if you like.
Fox and Fox. I always want to name foxes socks though.
I was thinking Jemima.
Ooh.
What about Jemima Socks?
Do you remember Socks the Fox?
Jemima Socks the fox.
In a box?
Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Hi, Jonathan. Hi, Adrada. Hi, Martin. Sneaky hidden Martin.
Now I have the rap version of Dr. Zeus in my head again.
Recently.
Man, those
It's
are
so
great.
good as hell. Hi,
Ina, how did your sewing go yesterday? You're doing off camera.
Yeah, I have a jumpsuit which is like a thing that looks like clothes but feels like pajamas, which is obviously
That's the dream.
the goal in the current situation. But I've like tapered one of the legs in, but not the other one. So I'm gonna go and do that like while we do story time.
Nice.
Is there still room for a Lucozade bottle in it? Is that what you're doing with this outfit?
Socks. We're going back to Terry Pratchett. So
I'm so sorry for spoiling Lucozade for any Lucozade out there.
Is the socks not the fox? Are you peeing on a fox?
Don't pee on the fox. Pee on the
I'm not
socks.
peeing. I'm not sure where that's come from. That's just Frankie.
That's jellyfish you're thinking of.
Oh yeah. You pee on a fox, you're a jellyfish, right?
You just want to be all snuggled up with this fox in your pants, apparently.
Socks and pants.
Yeah,
For the
all
fox.
brackets, like, you know.
Hey,
Monster
who else
Festival
is really enjoying
supplies.
the story, by the way?
Oh my God, it's so good.
It's so good.
It really ramped up.
Hi, Malcolm.
Hello.
Oh, it's Malcolm here. Do we have a Malcolm?
Hello.
Hello. How are you doing, honey pie?
Oh, not bad. I was just catching up while I painted for the last couple of hours.
Very nice.
Which was good.
How's the painting going?
Good, actually, until I get some paint delivered, so that'll be a week or something, maybe, or less, but I'm actually getting there.
Look forward to seeing how it all goes.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Carmen. I didn't realise we had a Carmen as well. In a wonderful hat, as always, like an extremely stylish in your lovely hat. Cute. Everybody's very cute. I'm here for it. Look, I did an exciting thing today.
What did you do?
I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
Was it dancing related or was it chivalry
I
related?
did do some dancing. I went out for now. Penultimate part. We ready? We steady? Should we go? Okay. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. It was only 5:30, but Sophia Winston was already sitting alone at her family's long dining table, finishing her tea and toast. For her first 19 years, Sophia had never been an early riser, preferring to languish in bed until her mother sent them, "Hold on a second, somebody is unmuted. Kitty and Rory, is that you? Is that you, you sexy bear?" No. Sorry, it's done. What was I saying? Oh, yes. For her first 19 years, Sophia had never been an early riser, preferring to languish in bed until her mother sent the maid in to wake and dress her. Now, however, she was awake and shivering before dawn. The poor maid was first forced to wake even earlier to build the fire in the dining room and ready her mistress's breakfast. Then the fire had to be lit in her rooms as well. She would retire there after she ate, before the maid could finally return downstairs and fall back into bed. Sophia had discovered she liked being awake this early, before the rest of the household. She preferred to be alone, reading her father's travel journals, sipping her tea by the dining room's roaring fireplace. The only unwelcome company was the portrait of herself as a Turkish princess, Charles's engagement gift to her. The portrait had been something of a disaster. On the canvas she stood not stately but pensive in her costume, even melancholy, her gaze lowered. She looked less like a princess than an odalisque, captured and resigned. Poor Charles had looked stricken at its unveiling. He'd said little at the supper afterward, only watched her hand shake as she ate her soup. Her mother had ordered the portrait hung in the dining room instead of the main hall, as though punishing it for failing to meet expectations. She sipped her tea and glanced at the clock. Her father liked to wake at 6. He would be down soon after for the day's papers, and then her mother would follow him to discuss the schedule. Little George would evade his governess and run in, demanding morning kisses. As much as she liked her solitude, she appreciated the morning commotion. It was a brief but necessary reminder that they were actually a family. She had almost finished her tea when she heard hurried footsteps in the front hall. She'd just had time to think that it was early for visitors and that she had not heard the bell when she heard a raised voice. It was one of the footmen, and then a woman's answer, forceful and urgent. A shout, and then the dining room door burst open. An apparition filled the doorway. It was one of the tallest women Sophia had ever seen. In her arms she carried, somehow, a full-grown man. "I'm sorry to intrude," said the woman in an accented voice, "but we need your fireplace." She strode into the room. Behind her appeared a man in ragged clothing. A footman lunged for the woman, but she was moving too quickly. How was it possible with the man in her arms? She brushed past Sophia, who'd stood in surprise, and Sophia caught a glimpse of her improbable burden. He was tall and thin and soaking wet. His face was hidden in the woman's shoulder. A thick metal cuff circled one wrist. It caught the firelight and flashed like a beacon. Shock coursed through her, stronger than any chill. She stood, mesmerised, as the woman knelt before the giant fireplace, swept the screen aside, and threw the man into the fire. The footman shouted in fright, but now the ill-dressed man grabbed him and tried to wrestle him out of the room, saying something in language Sophia couldn't place. The woman stared intently into the blaze, as though waiting for a sign. The fire had banked at the man's weight, but now it was crackling merrily again, surrounding him with flames like a Viking on his pyre. As Sophia watched, his clothing began to smoulder and burn away, leaving his skin whole and untouched. He told her a story once, hadn't he, while she lay half asleep in his arms? A story about the Djinn, fantastic creatures made of fire. And then, in Paris, that all-consuming heat, as though a burning spark had lodged inside her body. It made no sense at all, and yet something whispered to her, "Yes, of course. You have always known this." Clouds of smoke filled the room and the stench of burning cotton. The footman broke from his wrestling match and ran into the hall, presumably to raise the alarm. The ill-dressed foreigner scowled in resignation and went to the tall woman's side. He spoke to her in that other language, and she nodded. "Ahmad," she called. The figure on the fire stirred. "There!" the woman shouted, joy in her voice. The ragged man said something in reply, hand shielding his eyes. A commotion from outside, and then the butler strode in shouting, tailed by 3 footmen, and Sophia's heart sank to see her father. The woman turned at their approach, her back to the fireplace, as though to shield the man inside. She was bracing for a fight, Sophia realised. Her father was calling for the police. The whole room was about to break into pandemonium. "Everyone, please be quiet," Sophia shouted. And indeed, the room quieted, in surprise as much as anything. Sophia crossed to the fireplace and bent to see more clearly. "Sophia," her father called, a frightened warning. "It's all right, father," she said. "I know this man." "What?" The man on the fire moved again, convulsing as though in pain. The logs beneath him shifted, and Sophia and the woman jumped backward as he tumbled out of the fireplace in a cloud of smoke and ash. He came to rest curled on the flagstones, his body streaked with soot and embers. The air around him shimmered, and for a moment Sophia thought she saw him glowing like a coal. Swiftly, the tall woman bent over him. The ragged man said something in warning, and she pulled her hands back at the last moment. "Ahmad," she said. The man whispered something. "Yes, it's me," the woman said, and her voice was choked with emotion, though her eyes were dry. "I'm here." She touched his arm quickly, like a cook testing a pan for heat. Apparently finding him cool enough, she rested her hand on his shoulder. His eyes didn't open, but one hand reached up to cover hers. Sophia looked about the room and might have laughed at the tableau. The most prominent household in New York, reduced to gawking open-mouthed at a naked man on their dining room floor. The servants all hung back, some crossing themselves. Someone whispered to her father, "Sir, the police are in the hall." The woman's head came up at this, her look one of fierce protection. "No," Sophia said. She moved to stand in front of the three intruders. "Father, send the police away. They aren't needed." "Sophia, go upstairs. We'll speak later. I told you, I know this man. I'll vouch for him and his friends." "Don't be ridiculous. How could you possibly?" "They're my guests," she said firmly. "Send the police away, and someone please fetch this man a blanket." She turned away from them and bent over the familiar figure, who still had barely moved. The tall woman was watching her strangely, as though trying to see inside her. "You know him," the woman said. She nodded, took the man's other hand in hers. "Ahmad?" His eyes did not open, but his forehead creased in a frown. "Sophia," he murmured, and she heard her father draw a shocked breath. "Yes, it's me," she said, aware of the eyes on her, the too accurate conclusions they were all drawing. Her cheeks would have burned were she warm enough. "You're in my home. You're safe here." She cast a challenging glance at her father, but he only stood pale and stricken. "What happened to him?" she asked the woman. "He tried to end his own life." "My God! But why?" The woman looked like she would have said more, but then glanced about the room at the frightened and attentive faces. Sophia said, "Perhaps we should discuss this in private. We'll take him to my bedroom. There should be a fire lit already." A maid entered with a heavy wooden blanket. She handed it to Sophia and backed away, clearly terrified. Together, the tall woman and the ragged man covered their half-conscious charge and lifted him to his feet, supporting him from either side. Sophia placed a protective hand on the woman's arm, and together, under watchful eyes, the group walked from the dining room. "Father, I'll speak with you soon," she said as they left. They bundled him into Sophia's bed and placed a copper foot warmer under the covers. The ragged man, one Dr. Saleh, it seemed, who spoke only Arabic, set about strengthening the fire, and soon the room was warm enough even for Sophia's comfort. Then Dr. Saleh and the woman, whose name was apparently Chava, talked quietly together for some minutes, with frequent glances at Sophia. "I apologize for involving you in this," the woman said to her at length, "but we had no choice. Ahmad's life was at stake." A pause. "I take it that you know what he is." "I think so," Sophia said. "And you are the same?" The woman glanced away, suddenly self-conscious. "No," she said. "I'm something else. A golem." Sophia had no idea what that meant, but was unsure how to say this, so she merely nodded. "Please tell me what happened." And so the golem related the story. Sophia had a feeling that a number of details were being omitted, but only listened as the golem described finding the Djinni in Bethesda Fountain. "But that's where I first met him," Sophia said, confused. "And I still don't understand. Why would he do this?" "You may stop talking about me as though I'm not here," a voice muttered from the bed. The golem was first to his side. She moved so impossibly fast. "Hello, Ahmad," she said quietly. "Chava," he said. "You shouldn't have rescued me. Don't be foolish. Too much has been lost already." A harsh laugh. "You say more than you know." "Hush." She took his hand and squeezed it, as though making certain he was truly there. And suddenly Sophia felt like an interloper in her own bedroom. The Djinni noticed Dr. Saleh and said something to him in Arabic, his tone affronted. The doctor responded in kind, gruff and sarcastic, then wiped a hand across his brow. He had, Sophia noticed, gone rather sickly looking. The golem asked a question, and he replied dismissively, but it was clear that the heat of the room disagreed with him. "I'm afraid Dr. Saleh has had a strenuous morning and little to eat," the golem told her. "Of course. I'll take him downstairs and make certain he's seen to." A faraway look had come into the golem's eyes. She said, "You may also assure everyone at the foot of the stairs that we're not, in fact, murdering you, and there's no need to break down the door." Sophia stared at her. "What? Truly?" "I'm afraid so." "In that case, I thank you for the warning," she said, and resolved to find out what a golem was as soon as possible. She took Dr. Saleh down to the kitchen and told the staff in no uncertain terms to feed him and see to his needs. They stared at her as though she'd grown horns, but nodded and bobbed all the same. Whispers trailed her as she left. Upstairs, she was told that her parents were in the library, waiting to speak with her. She decided she would take this as an opportunity. The servants, she'd tell her parents, were bound to gossip, and her reputation would most certainly be damaged. Why not break the engagement now, before it could end in ignominy? And perhaps it would be best if she travelled for a while the rumours ran their course. India, South America, Asia, the warmer climates. She tried to hide her smile as she opened the library door. The morning service was already underway when Michael Levy reached his uncle's old synagogue. He'd been wandering the Lower East Side, trying to comprehend the ruin of his life, when he'd realised where his path was taking him. He had no strength left to change his course. He could not stomach the idea of going home, but neither could he go back to the sheltering house for fear that she would still be there. He supposed she should be grateful that she'd managed to warn him, that he'd escaped with his life, But at the moment, gratitude lay far beyond his reach. His uncle's old synagogue had originally been a Methodist church. It was a blandly anonymous worship hall of rough-hewn grey stone, neither imposing nor welcoming, the sort of building that might change hands a dozen times with the neighbours none the wiser. Inside, 20 or so men gathered at the front of the wooden pews. Most were nearing his uncle's age. Michael hesitated just outside the sanctuary, suddenly resistant. He dreaded being recognised by his uncle's old cohorts. They would whisper praises to God on his behalf, claim him as proof that one always returns to faith in times of difficulty. Well, would they be wrong? He had accepted as truth that his wife was a clay creature brought to life by what? The will of God? Must he believe in God now if he was to make sense of this? The thought made him feel petulant, as though he were a child again, being dragged to school against his will. But neither could he unlearn what he'd discovered. The service began, the men's voices surging and falling. You have turned my lament into dancing. You have loosened my sackcloth and girded me with joy. They chanted the psalms and praises, and as always, the rhythm fastened itself to his heartbeat. It seemed unfair that the prayers could affect him this way, against his will, that he could scoff at the sentiments, yet find himself mouthing along. He imagined himself at 90, toothless and doddering, unable to remember anything except for the morning prayers. They were his deepest memories, his first music. He didn't know when, exactly, he'd stopped believing. It had not come on suddenly, nor had he argued himself into disbelief, no matter what his uncle had thought. No, he'd simply noticed one day that God had disappeared. Perhaps he'd never truly believed in the first place. Or else he'd simply swapped one belief for another, loving neither God nor atheism, but ideology for its own sake, as he'd fallen in love not with a woman, but the image of one. Chava Levi, he thought, you are a hard fact to live with. All at once his throat filled with tears. Holding back a sob, he left his spot at the sanctuary door and returned to the street. He could no longer hear the chanting, but his mind took up the thread, leading him unwillingly through the rest of the service as he walked back to the sheltering house. It was his only true home now, and he supposed if he had a religion, the house was its temple, dedicated not to gods or ideas, but living, fallible men. If his wife was there, he would face her. The house was just waking up when he arrived. The smell of coffee wafted down the hallway. He could hear the ancient pipes creaking in the walls. He braced himself, but his office was empty, the door ajar. He sat down at his desk and, despite everything, was contemplating starting the ordinary business of the day when he realised that Joseph Scholl's sheaf of burnt papers was missing. In his alcoholic fog of the night before, he'd forgotten all about it, had, in fact, forgotten about Joseph. Frantically, he searched his desk. His uncle's notes were still inside the drawer, where Michael had shoved them, but Joseph's burnt pages were nowhere to be seen. Had Joseph returned from wherever he'd disappeared to and found them in his office? Or had his wife taken them? If he could just locate them and return them to their spot under Joseph's cot and keep him none the wiser. A shadow fell across his open door. It's strange, Joseph said mildly. I was just looking for something myself. I think we might have a thief among us. He regarded Michael. Or perhaps you already knew that. An icy sweat broke out on Michael's brow. He stood there, trapped, painfully aware of his visible guilt and terror. I see, Joseph said. He closed the door behind him with a quiet click. His face, Michael saw, was bruised and cut, and his clothing glinted with what looked like tiny pieces of glass. So, how shall we proceed, you and I? I don't have your papers, Michael said. They're gone. They disappeared. Joseph raised an eyebrow. And did you read them before they disappeared? Yes. Ah, but did you understand? Enough? Joseph nodded. Don't think too harshly of your wife, he said. She was only following her nature as best she could. A golem is lost without a master. I wanted to be her husband, not her master. How enlightened of you, Joseph said. His voice had turned flat, its usual drollness gone. Now, where is my property? I don't know. Hazard a guess. Michael said nothing. Joseph sighed. Perhaps you don't understand after all. I was being kind. I have no need to ask. An absurd laugh bubbled up in Michael's throat. Joseph, annoyed, said, Is something amusing you? I was just realizing that this is who you've been all this time. And what of it? Oh, nothing. Only you really did help them, you know. Who? All the men who've come through this house. You helped them find their cots and gave them good advice and cleaned up after them. You were a friendly face in a strange city. It must have been torture for you. You have no idea. Michael smiled. Good. I'm glad it hurt. Though I pity you, I really do. All that power doesn't seem to have gotten you very far. Joseph's eyes had turned to slits. Michael swallowed and said, In fact, if you think about it, all those men, the one you hated helping, they've all moved on from here to bigger and better things. You're the one who's been left behind. Spare me your pity, Joseph said, and then lunged forward and grabbed Michael by the head. Michael never lost consciousness as his memories were torn apart. His assailant proceeded in haphazard fashion, grabbing fistfuls of moments in his rage, so that as he died, Michael was bombarded with recollections. He was playing stickball in the street with his friends. He was fleeing down a hallway, running for his life. His aunt cried while he tore up a letter, unread, from his father. A nurse at Swinburne pressed a cool hand to his forehead. He'd skipped school and now his uncle was bending him over his knee, the half-hesitant slaps betraying discomfort at the task. He was standing in a parlour, watching a tall woman descend a staircase, his heart a joyous, painful weight. At last, Joseph let go, and Michael collapsed, unseeing, to the floor. Shalman stood a moment, considering what he'd gleaned. Then he stepped to the desk and opened a drawer. There, stuffed in at the top, were Rabbi Meir's notes on the golem, right where Michael had left them. Shalman leafed through the notes with growing excitement, following the rabbi's painstaking process, his discoveries and setbacks. At last he understood why Meir had stolen those precious volumes from his own colleagues. He'd thought the man to be his nemesis, when in truth Meir had been building a precious gift for him to find. He had to acknowledge its subtle artistry, so much calmer and more practicable than his own frenzied divinations. The formula's requirement that it be used only with the golem's permission, for example, that was something he could never have constructed, though in truth, he would never have thought to try. An odd irony to ask that the golem part freely with her own free will. No doubt Maya had envisioned a heartfelt conversation with his charge, a solemn and reasoned decision. Charlemagne folded the formula and placed it in his pocket, and reflected that in this instance his own methods would trump Maya's. After all, a choice made under coercion was still a choice. Chapter 28. The golem was struggling to comprehend. For long minutes now, the Djinni had been talking in a low, tired voice, telling her a story of long ago, of a grasping desert wizard and a young girl named Fadwa al-Hadid. He described the pain of the binding and the feel of Fadwa's throat beneath his hands, and how Ibn Malik had died only to be reborn again and again. "It seems you know the rest," the Djinni said as she sat, stunned, at the side of Sophia's bed. He was half sitting up now, buried beneath expensive linens, his shoulders against the curved headboard. "Ibn Malik became Yehuda Shalman." "Joseph Shal," she murmured. "And you saw his memories?" His hand was resting above the coverlet, and the golem took it in her own, noting that it was beginning to feel weighty again. "So this is why you tried to kill yourself," she said. "To end Ibn Malik's life through your own death." He was watching her now, sorrow in every line of his face. He expected her to regret saving him, she realized, now that she knew the whole truth. "Listen to me," she said. "This is Ibn Malik's doing, not yours." "And Fadwa," he said. "If I hadn't injured her, then none of this would have happened." "You place too much of a burden on yourself. Yes, Fadwa's injury can be laid at your feet, but Ibn Malik was not acting on your orders, and Shalman has a free will of his own." "I'm not so certain of that last one," the Djinni said. "I saw his lives, and they all followed the same pattern, as though he could not break free of his own disposition." The golem's mouth twisted. "You believe he couldn't choose not to do evil?" "We all have our natures," said the Djinni quietly. She wanted to argue, but where would it lead her except to point a finger back at herself? Frustrated, she rose, paced a few steps. "Yes, you were selfish and careless with Fadwa," she said, "but you cannot accept the blame for the rest, disposition or no. If Shalman had not existed, then neither would I. Are you responsible for all my actions, the good as well as the bad? You cannot pick and choose and leave the rest behind." He gave her a shadow of his usual smile. "I suppose not," he said. Then he sobered. "But do you see now why I can't keep living?" "No," she said shortly. "Chava, didn't you stop me from destroying myself once? We'll find another way." He winced but didn't reply, only looked down at her hand, still gripping his on the coverlet. A knock came at the door. It was Sophia carrying a pile of folded clothing. Servants were hovering in the hall behind her, trying to see in. She shut the door on them. "Hello, Sophia," the Djinni said quietly. She smiled. "You're looking better." She placed the folded clothing on the bed. "My father's not as tall as you, but hopefully something will fit." "Sophia," he said, his voice heavy, and it was clear he was about to apologize. For drawing her into this misadventure, or for something earlier in their acquaintance, the golem could only guess at the content. But Sophia crisply interrupted. Dr. Sala is freshening himself in the guest quarters, she said. We should join him there soon, if you're feeling able. The Djinni nodded, abashed. I'm afraid we've caused you a great deal of trouble, the golem said. Perhaps, Sophia said, though she seemed oddly unconcerned, even happy. Even so, I'm glad you thought to come here. She turned to the Djinni, sobering. You should have told me. He sighed. Would you have believed it? No, probably not. Still, you might have tried. The Djinni hesitated, then said, Are you well, Sophia? It was only then that the golem noticed the young woman's pale skin and too warm clothing, the tremor in her hands. Sophia considered her reply, and the golem sensed a knotted tangle of longings and regrets, and, above all, a deep desire not to be pitied. I've been ill, Sophia said, but I believe I'm improving. She smiled. Now, please, put on some clothes. I'll be back to fetch you in a few minutes. She left, and the Djinni began to sort through the items she brought. The golem sat on a corner of the bed, not sure where to look. Watching him dress was somehow more intimate than seeing him naked. She went to the young woman's dressing table, idly examining the objects scattered there. A gilded hairbrush, a beautiful necklace of silver and glass, an apothecary's assortment of bottles and jars. Atop a jeweller's box sat a golden bird in a cage, its provenance unmistakable. You made her one too, she said. The Djinni buttoned his shirt collar. Is that jealousy? At least she didn't return hers. I couldn't keep it. I was about to marry, the golem muttered. Silence hung between them. Michael, the Djinni said at last. He's been caught up in this as well, hasn't he? She sighed. There's something else I haven't told you. And he listened, shocked and grave by turns, as she described finding Michael at the sheltering house with Charleman's spells and her struggle with their contents. Where are they now? He said. Anna has them, she said, and then, at the face he made, I couldn't leave them at the bakery. She's hiding them somewhere, but I don't know what to do with them. Burn them, he said shortly. Destroy all that knowledge? Charleman's knowledge, Ibn Malik's. I thought, she said quietly, that I might use them to free you. That struck him a visible blow. She watched him turn away, struggling with himself. After a moment, he looked down at his shirt and started tugging on the sleeves. Sophia's father has very short arms, he muttered. Ahmad, no, you mustn't use this knowledge. Promise me this. I promise, she murmured. Good. He gave a sigh. Now, tell me, am I presentable to the household? She looked him over, smiling slightly. Sophia's father was wider than the Djinni, and the borrowed garments billowed like sails. More so than before. He grimaced. At least they aren't the rags that Arbili gave me when I came out of the flask. You were naked then, too. Do you make such a habit of it? But he was gazing past her, unseeing. The flask, he said. What about it? Mariam Fadul still has it, and it's been repaired. Arbili replaced the seal. He said he copied it exactly. He paused and then said, his voice strained, You were right, Chava. There's another way. but you won't like it. Anna left the Radzins bakery with her strange package, wondering what exactly she'd been entrusted with. The flat, crackling lump at the bottom of the sack could only be a stack of papers. What was written on them? Someone's secrets? An incriminating confession? Her promise notwithstanding, she almost opened the sack to peek inside. But then she remembered who had given it to her and the horrors she'd already witnessed. This would be no clandestine love diary. Best not to know. She would think of a hiding place quickly and be done. In the end, she chose the dance hall on Broome Street. It was in her mind already, thanks to the Golem. She hadn't been back there since that terrible night, and given its new associations, she doubted she ever would. But when she tried to think of somewhere else, her mind kept circling back. She even knew exactly where she'd hide the sack, atop the old armoire in the back room where they kept the linens for the tables. All she had to do was find Mendel the doorman and cajole him into giving her the key. As far as she knew, he still worked at a piece workshop on Delancey, pressing new trousers. Hopefully he'd be there. Yehuda Shalman sat scowling at a writing desk in the house parlour, covering a sheet of paper with scrawled and scratched out lines. The formula to find a lost object should have been easy to remember. He'd used it hundreds of times. But his memories were no longer safe ground. To delve too deeply was to risk rousing his former selves, who might then chime in with their own solutions, deafening him in the cacophony. He had to tread lightly, sidling up to a recollection and examining it askance, capturing the formula a few syllables at a time. It was a slow and painstaking process, and he was in no mood to accommodate it. A shriek sounded down the hall. He ignored it, ignored the pounding footsteps and the growing sounds of alarm, and tried to concentrate. At last, the formula to find his sheaf of spells was complete. He looked it over. It seemed correct, then braced himself and spoke what he'd written. And then he saw a flash of a woman's dark workaday skirt, the waist let out to accommodate an 8th-month belly. At her side, she held a flour sack. The woman, and now Shalman recognised her from the tenement hallway, was standing in an open doorway, flirting with a large, sweating boy. She told him something in a teasing voice. The boy's glance darted briefly to her stomach. He said something, a demand. The girl did not look pleased, but finally she nodded. The boy took a string from around his neck. On it hung a door key. He dangled it high, making the girl reach, and as she did, he grabbed her and kissed her roughly on the mouth, then reached to grope at her breast. She allowed it for a few moments, then pushed him away firmly, her expression calm. A flash of guilt on the boy's face. Then he sniggered at her and went back in. The door closed. Her face crumpled for a moment, but then she composed herself. Clutching the key and the flour sack, she went down to the street. Shalman took note of the shops, the street corners, saw that she was only a few blocks away. On Broome, she went to an unmarked door, fitted the key in the padlock, and disappeared inside. Shalman came to, his head swimming. He sat as still as possible until his vision was restored and the pounding in his temples had lessened. The pregnant girl, she knew his golem, did she not? Perhaps he had found not only his missing spells, but the bait to snare his golem's consent. Outside the parlour, the hallway was in commotion. A crowd had formed around Michael's office door. The housekeeper sat on the staircase sobbing. The cook was talking to a policeman. She saw Shalman and her look implored him. "Joseph, see what has happened." But he was already gone, down the hall and out the door. The Winstons' hansom, though elegant, was not quite roomy enough for three, but they squeezed in nonetheless, Saleh, the Djinni, and the Golem. The horse tramped smartly through the Winstons' gate and onto Fifth Avenue, only to be stymied in the morning traffic with everyone else. Stuffed into the corner, Saleh started drifting into sleep. He fought it at first, but fatigue and his newly full stomach — the cook had given him a plate of cold meats and a brandied fruit compote, though it was clear she'd rather be shot — soon had him snoring. The Djinni was thankful. It afforded some privacy without so obvious a tactic as switching languages. But the Golem, it seemed, was in no mood to talk. Earlier, she'd put up surprisingly little protest at his plan, only asking a few practical questions and translating into English for Sophia. Now she seemed conspicuously silent, even for her. She stared at the cabs and carts that idled around them, her face like a stone. In any case, it wasn't as though he knew what to say to her. Everything that came to mind seemed either too trivial or too final. If all went well, if the plan worked, he would never see her again. "Will it hurt?" she asked abruptly, startling him. "Being in the flask again. Will it hurt you?" "No," he said. "At least, I don't remember any pain." "Perhaps it did hurt," she said, her voice toneless, "for 1,000 years. And you just don't remember." "Chava, no, say nothing. I'll go along with this plan because we must do something to prevent Shalman from finding you and using you. But don't think for a minute that I do it gladly. You're turning me into your jailer. You're the only one with the strength to put me in the flask. It certainly weakened Ibn Malik. I think it might kill someone like Saleh." "No one is asking him to." "Of course not. I only meant—" He trailed off, frustrated. "I know how much this asks of you. Leaving New York, going to Syria. The voyage won't be comfortable for you on a crowded ship." "The voyage is the least of it," she said. "What if your kin can't protect you from him? What if there aren't any Djinn anymore?" He flinched and she said, "I know, but we must consider it. Am I supposed to just bury you in the desert and hope for the best?" "Yes, if you must. And then leave me. Go somewhere far away, as far as possible. I won't have you defending me. He may not be your master, but he can destroy you just the same." "But where should I go? To start over somewhere else? I can barely picture it. I'm not like you. New York is all I know." "It won't be for long. He doesn't have much time left. A few years at most." "And after that? Shall I search the world for his reincarnations and murder them in their cradles?" "I think I know you better than that." "Oh, do you?" "Then you could do it? Truly?" A pause, and then, "No. Even knowing, no." They fell silent. The hansom crept along, finally reaching the southern edge of the park. They cut west, and the air grew heavy with the exhalations of the trees beyond the wall. At last he asked, "Will Michael be all right without you?" He tried and failed not to tense at the name. "Michael will be better off for my leaving. I hope he can forgive me someday." She glanced across at him. "I haven't told you why I married him." "Maybe I don't want to know," he muttered. "I did it because you'd taken the paper from my locket. I couldn't destroy myself. I had to live in the world and I was terrified. So I hid behind Michael. I tried to turn him into my master. I honestly thought it would be better that way. The self-recrimination in her voice was painful to hear. You were frightened, he said. Yes, and in my fear I made the weakest, most selfish mistake of my existence. So how can you possibly trust me to carry your life in my hands? I trust you above all others, he told her. Above myself. She shook her head, but then leaned into him as though taking shelter. He drew her close, the crown of her head beneath his cheek. Beyond the hansoms' window, New York was an endless rhythm of walls and windows and doors, darkened alleys, flashes of sunlight. He thought if he could pick a moment to be taken into the flask, a moment to live in endlessly, perhaps he would choose this one. The passing city and the woman at his side. It was mid-morning, the coffee house's busiest hour. At the sidewalk tables, backgammon pieces clicked on the boards. Inside, men discussed business in idle tones. Arbeely sat alone, toying with his coffee cup. The shop had been too quiet that morning, the silence pressing against his ears. His eye kept straying from his work to the Djinni's unoccupied bench. Arbeely reminded himself that he'd done well before meeting his erstwhile partner, and would do so again. Yet the entire shop seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the Djinni to come through the door. Finally, he could take no more and went to the faduls to distract himself with the buzz of other people's conversations. He glanced around at the full tables. Mariam travelled about with her coffee and gossip, easily navigating the crowded room. From his vantage, he could see how each table grew more lively at her arrival, how each of her smiles was a push to the flywheel that kept the coffee house humming. In the kitchen, Saeed ground the coffee and cardamom and boiled the water in his own practiced dance. Watching them, Arbeely felt a swelling of loneliness. As if drawn like a moth to his melancholy, Mariam soon angled towards him, concern on her face. Boudras, are you all right? He wanted to ask her, Mariam, have I been a bachelor too long? Did I miss my chance? But a shadow fell across the doorway, and the conversations around them paused. It was the Djinni. At his side was a tall, imposing woman whom Arbeely had never seen before. And behind them was a man dressed like a vagrant, but who held himself like a person of consequence. His features tugged at Arbeely's memory. Ice cream Saleh, someone whispered, and he was shocked to realise that it was true. The Djinni's gaze swept the coffee house until he found Mariam and then Arbeely next to her. A moment of surprise, but then, undeterred, he cut across the coffee house towards them, his companions close behind. Mariam was staring at Saleh, mouth agape. Mahmoud? The dark eyes, newly sharp, threatened tears. Mariam, the man said, his voice thick. It's a pleasure to see you. She laughed, delighted, her own eyes filling in response. Oh, Mahmoud, how wonderful. But how did this happen? Her gaze went to the Djinni and she turned wary. Her husband came to the kitchen door, ready to intervene. Perhaps we could speak with you in private, the Djinni said quietly. And then to Arbeely, I think you should hear this as well. And so, after a few quick words with Saeed, she took them to her home above the coffee house and sat them at her parlour table. Then the genie began to talk. In low, plain words, he uncloaked himself, apologizing for the lies they told her, one by one. He explained who the tall woman sitting beside him was, and Arbili, still reeling from the genie's newfound frankness, struggled to comprehend her existence. "Last night I met a woman made of clay," the genie had told him once. And now here she was, a solemn Hebrew giantess, answering Mariam's questions in perfect Arabic while the genie listened, his concern for her plain and startling. "Wait," Arbili interjected, confused and incredulous. "Are you saying you mean to go back into the flask?" Had this woman coerced him? Had she woven some spell? The woman, eyes lowered, murmured something to the genie in another language. The genie said, "Arbili, your fears are unfounded. This is my decision alone." Somehow this did not make him feel any better. Another question from Mariam, and this time Saleh answered, telling of a man who'd come knocking at the genie's door. He described the wrenching pain of the exorcism, like a dentist extracting a rotten tooth. And then the golem and the genie both, their comments in counterpoint. My creator, my master. It all sounded like madness. But Mariam listened and considered. At length she went to the kitchen and returned with the flask and placed it in the centre of the table. They all stared at it, save the genie, who looked away, his mouth tight. The sunlight picked out the intricate tracing, the curving lines and loops that wove through one another, chasing their own tails. "It is yours," Mariam said, "if you want it." "You believe them?" Arbili blurted in surprise. "Must I believe to part with it? To me it's merely my mother's old copper flask. It's clear that Ahmad values it much more highly." She picked it up and handed it to the genie, who took it as though it were a powder keg. "I wish you luck, Ahmad." "Thank you," said the genie. And then, looking around, "Is Matthew?" "He's at school," said Mariam. The genie nodded, his disappointment plain. Mariam hesitated. At last she said, "I'll tell him you said goodbye." They went down to the street, the flask held tightly in the genie's hand. Mariam took her leave and returned to her customers, squeezing her husband's shoulder in passing. The rest of them stood uncomfortably in the noonday light, the sense of urgency straining against a sorrowful reluctance. The genie had explained that there was little time. Their only defense now was speed and distance, fleeing across the ocean before Shalman knew to follow. The ship to Marseille would leave in a few hours. Sophia was arranging a single steerage ticket. And before that, the golem must retrieve Shalman's spells from Anna so that they, too, could be buried in the desert. "And you, Saleh?" the genie asked. "What will you do now?" The question had been lurking in Saleh's mind ever since he'd woken clear-eyed on the genie's bare floor. Should he go on as Ice Cream Saleh, measuring his life in pennies and turns of the churn handle? Or become Dr. Mahmoud once again? In truth, neither name seemed to fit anymore. He suspected he was now something else, something new, but he had no idea what. He'd lived so long in anticipation of his own death that to contemplate his future was like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a vertiginous rush of open sky. "I'll have to consider," he said. "For now, I'll content myself with finding my churn." And he too said goodbye, his gaze lingering on the genie's face before he turned away. "Well," Arbili said, growing awkward, "I'll miss you, Ahmad." The genie raised an eyebrow. Really? Yesterday you implied otherwise. Arbili waved a hand. Forget all that. Besides, he said, attempting humour, who will I argue with now? Matthew? I'll miss you as well, the Djinni wanted to say, but it was not the truth. The flask would not allow him to miss any of them. Grief squeezed him again, and the beginnings of panic. He clasped Arbili's hand, then broke away, half turning his back. We must do this soon, he muttered to the golem, or I'll lose my nerve. Hava, Arbili said, I'm glad we met. Please, take good care of him. She nodded, and then Arbili too was gone. They stood alone on the busy sidewalk. Then this is it, the golem murmured. It must happen now. The Djinni nodded. But then he paused. Something strange was happening. A creeping dimness crossed his vision, and his hearing began to fade. With no warning, the sidewalk vanished, and he was wrenched away. Anna stood before him, holding a stack of crumbling pages. Her face was empty, her features slack. His own hands, veined and spotted, reached out to her shoulders. Slowly he turned her around, stepped behind her, and considered the image they made in the mirrored column, as though posed for a family portrait. Behind them, the dance hall was flooded with light. He reached up his hands and placed them around the girl's throat. Bring the creature here, he told his reflection, and the flask as well, or I will make you a murderer again. He felt the golem's cool skin beneath his fingers. His hands had moved on their own, had grabbed her wrist as though to drag her to Shalman's side. The binding, the Djinni realised. It had never been broken. And now Shalman could control him, just as Ibn Malik had. Aghast, she said, Ahmad, what is it? What's wrong? What a fool Shalman was, the Djinni thought bitterly. How little he knew his own creation. Why bother to threaten him when the golem would never knowingly abandon Anna, not even to secure a greater good? She would go to him of her own free will, and he would not let her go alone.
And that was how it ended.
Yeah. The end. Did you want to
Shit, what an ending.
Oh my goodness.
Dum 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 dum.
Amazing.
Dum, dum. How y'all doing? Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.
Did you
Kitty,
stop it?
okay? Did I stop it?
Oh.
What?
I was going to say, did you stop it mid-chapter there? Or was that an actual end of a chapter? Ah, you naughty person. Naughty, naughty, naughty.
How could you do this to us?
Skillfully done.
You just live.
Although very annoying.
I live for cliffhangers. I live for them.
I thought you just lived to torture us, but you know.
Yes.
Little column A, little column B.
Did y'all enjoy it?
Yeah, it's all coming together now.
Gordon, do you have notes?
I mean, I have thoughts, but I don't have notes because it was all, it was too engrossing to take notes. I'm very disappointed. Well, I mean, it's really good story-wise, but I'm so sad about Michael.
Oh, poor
That was-
Michael.
That was awful. And when Shava said, you know, the worst thing she'd ever done was marry him, and I'm like, yeah, you're not wrong. You're really not wrong.
Yeah. Yep.
Poor guy.
Oh yeah. Was it worth it for the almond macaroons?
I don't know. Almond macaroons are pretty good.
And they are
I
pretty.
mean, and I'm sure these were fantastic ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh. Ooh, I could just fancy an almond macaroon. I might have to try and get some tomorrow.
I feel like he must have gotten more out of it